I'm Mike Adams. I know this has been up here a long time. This is what I'm going to try to cover today. I wrote the book, and it's a giant, really thick book. It'll keep you occupied for weeks and weeks. What I want to talk about today, and I've titled this The Local Lee, because something that Lee DeForest did that was the most significant thing of his entire career that made everything happen, he did it in Palo Alto at one of the first Silicon Valley startups. And that is that he made his Audion tube into an amplifier of audio, and thus radio broadcasting for audiences and also sound film. So I want to emphasize the local Lee DeForest, but because I wrote this book and because I teach students how to do research and how to think about subjects like this, I want to also do something for you that my students are always encouraged to do too, and that's to kind of use multimedia. In other words, I wrote a book, which is Springer Science. They dated it 2012, but it came out in last December. But I also have had the LeeDeForest.org website, and I've had that since since the 80s, when I was on the Parham Foundation and we had the DeForest papers. This was in Foothill College, mind you, in the late 80s. I took out the LeeDeForest.org website, and I've been doing it ever since. And it's the main website. If you type in Lee DeForest into your browser, you will get that, which will give you a link to the Facebook page. I also created a Facebook page for DeForest, and I did that because I have a lot of little movies, sound movies. One of DeForest's claim to fame, he did these little movies. I also have some visuals, and I put those on the Facebook. So it's something you can't get in just a book. So what I've tried to do is give people kind of the multimedia. I call it the author's work. When I'm Wrong one. Oh, there we go. When I'm working with research, which is something I really like to do, the main question that you always have to ask is, how do you know what you know, right? And it's very important. And this is what separates an educated approach from one that's, well, somebody told me that and I believe it, but the question is, how do you know what you know? And so there are 3 archives that I went to for primary information on Lee DeForest when I was writing this book. The largest collection is in San Jose, and I'll tell you the most fascinating thing about the San Jose collection, which is in History San Jose, are DeForest school books from his time at Yale University, from in the late 1890s. DeForest was BA and PhD Yale, and we actually have his book. So you can see what he was thinking, sitting there in class. You can see what he was learning. He was learning about Hertz and Maxwell and all the famous theoreticians and inventors of the day through his professors at Yale. And then we have some later things here from the teens where he's experimenting and doing drawings. But there's a lot of stuff, including diaries. So there's plenty of DeForest stuff. The Case Museum gives perspective to the DeForest story because DeForest worked with Theodore Case, an inventor that worked with DeForest on the film project during the decade of the 1920s. And as you know, DeForest collected and saved everything possible, but it's all favorable to DeForest, as we all. We're the gatekeepers of our own story, right? But if you go to the Case Museum, you get actual letters that are nowhere else that DeForest and Case exchanged about sound on film. And there, it gives you a fascinating glimpse into a story which I tell in about 4 chapters of this book. There's also technology that is nowhere else. The adapter for playing back sound films on a silent projector, DeForest phonofilms. And you can see this little wire-wound rheostat. If you look right there, it's DeForest in script letters, like he actually somebody who made this by hand, right? So interesting stuff. There are also photographs as well. And then the third collection, which most people don't know about, is at the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History, the so-called Seaver Center on Western History. There, not only was I able to get a perspective on other film inventors and a history of film, but also there is a phonofilm scrapbook, something that should have been in the San Jose collection. It used the same format, the same scrapbook format, filled with pictures and letters and things like that. It is at the Seaver Center. Also some photographs and other things. So this this is how, when someone asks the question, well, how do you know what you know? Well, I know from looking in these 3 archives, I know from examining all the patents, and I also know from examining what some people call the first draft of history, that is the newspaper stories that were written between the beginning of the 20th century and the 1950s when DeForest was finishing out his life. Quick biography about DeForest. He was born in Iowa, raised in Alabama. He received his PhD from the Yale University Sheffield Scientific School. This was in 1899. Here's what he wrote in his diary when he graduated from Yale. He said, "My specialty then shall be the condenser." So he was his doctoral work was on Heinrich Hertz, reflections of waves on parallel wires or something. We have it in San Jose. We have his actual work from his doctoral thesis. Here's what I found to be the most important thing from the collection from Yale. And this was from an 1897 notebook where he was sitting in class. He drew this diagram, and you can see it's a microphone and a battery, an inductance, a transformer, right? And the secondary of the transformer modulates an arc lamp and in series with a DC source. And he says, talking arc, like speaking flame, it gives a fine reproduction of any sound at the microphone and vice versa. And this I call his talisman. This, when I saw this, I said, oh my gosh, this is what DeForest did every time he invented. He went to the flame, right? His flame detector, which didn't work, but it inspired his vacuum tube audion. His arc transmitter, the early radio transmitter, was an arc, right? His flame microphone, which he invented, dangerous thing, you know, flames, right? Gas flames. Flame microphone in the 1920s. His sound on film process, his very first way of writing with light on film was an arc. And his flat panel television, which used a bunch of flames. This he talked about in the 1950s, but never really went any farther. But you know, there's a lot of detail on that, which I will obviously not go into, but it is in the book. Okay. DeForest was fortunate that he had 3 good decades as an inventor. Most of us, you look at artists, at creative people, at scientists, you know, we might have 10 good years where we're really cranking out the hits, and then all of a sudden we're just okay, right? I mean, all of us have that. You know, maybe as a writer, maybe I have just a few good years in there where things were going just right. DeForest had 3 good decades. His first decade, he immediately upon college graduation improved upon Marconi's wireless, and he was popular in wireless and sold wireless equipment for one very good reason I talk about in the book. Whenever they referred to him, they always said, you know, our equipment is from the American DeForest. So there was this thing about, you know, well, Marconi, he's not American, you know, he's from the UK, and so we ought to give our business to DeForest. And of course, many people did, even though he got in trouble for stock fraud. Abraham White, you've all heard of. The entire story is in the book. Between 1907 and 1920, he worked on the 3-element vacuum tube broadcasting music, also using arc and vacuum tube transmitters. And then his final good decade, the decade of the 20s, he tends to call it his lost decade because he did not succeed. He did develop a system and patent it for writing a soundtrack optically on motion picture film. It did work, but it ended up in court like a lot of inventor things, and it did not work. One of the main things I want to emphasize about DeForest is he took the science of the 19th century, because he was a scholar. He knew about all the literature. He knew about what other scientists were doing. He had all the patents, as all inventors did back then. Try to figure out a way of doing things just different enough to get a patent and maybe make a profit. But he turned that 19th century science, the theory and experiments of many, into an art form, several art forms in the 20th century, the electronic media of radio, film, and then television. And my publisher titled the book, you know, I was going to call it Lee DeForest and the Invention of Sound on Film or something linear and kind of, you know, stodgy, but Springer came up with the cover, which is really very good, based on a photograph I gave them of the DeForest star in Hollywood, and they came up with the title. And when I first heard it, I thought, oh, well, is that a little over the top? People will say, no, he wasn't the king. No, he wasn't the king of television, but I like it. So it's catchy. It's catchy, and so it stayed that way. But he did do this, and he did this mostly, again, I emphasize, his most important contribution was the amplification that he managed to discover with the vacuum tube, because this allowed audiences. You know, in 1920, hams with earphones, that was radio. Well, amplification was going to change that and put it into loudspeakers, and families were going to enjoy radio. Same thing with film. The silent film was okay, but and some of the earlier experiments in silent film used earphones, actually, but DeForest really, we can say, gave voice to the radio and to the motion picture, if anything else. I want to talk a little bit about how the inventor invents, and I want to use the example of the vacuum tube. I don't know how often I've gone to conferences and people have said, oh yeah, DeForest vacuum tube, he stole it from Fleming. Well, it's not that clear cut, and let me explain why. And this is, again, based on what I know, my research. First of all, let's go back to Edison in 1880, who actually invented the light bulb, and he noticed that as the bulbs burned week after week, there would be a black carbon deposit from the filament on the inside of the bulb, which of course would make the light get dimmer and dimmer, and this was not good, right? So Edison looked at this and he said, well, you know, I think electrons go from, in his case, from the filament to a plate. He put a plate inside the bulb to draw off the electrons. He didn't really know why, but it did, and thus the bulb would not necessarily carbon up, and but he used the plate. He used it as a measurement of current flow. It was the early theory of thermionic emission. Well, he put it aside. He patented it. He called it the Edison effect. He put it aside. Well, here's Ambrose Fleming. Fleming worked for Edison. Fleming was in the UK, running Edison in the UK, and then he went to work for Marconi at the beginning of the century. And so Fleming's interest, because he had to work for a living, he had to do what Marconi said, and Marconi was in the business of Morse code, two-way communication, nothing else. He didn't want radio or audio or music, he wanted code. And so Fleming got a patent for a diode vacuum tube, a rectifier, but using it as a detector of wireless signals. He got this in 1905. Now, Fleming's tube, and you can see the little red square there, when it detects the presence of a dot or a dash, it makes a meter called a galvanometer move from one part to the other. I've not really seen one. I know we have a galvanometer up here somewhere, but this is what Fleming's thing did, because Fleming worked for Marconi, and this was a detector of Morse code, the on or off of the dots and dashes. Well, Fleming could not go much farther, and he might have. You know, we can always say, well, maybe Edison would have invented the vacuum tube. Maybe Fleming would have if he hadn't had to work for a guy that only cared about Morse code. Well, DeForest came along, and I have a letter in the book quoting DeForest. He writes to his attorney and says, you know, get me that Fleming patent, because DeForest wanted to look at it carefully. Well, what he did a year later, and he also did this for wireless telegraph, because he had not yet started the process of working on voice transmission, radio telephone. What DeForest did was take the same Fleming tube, and he added headphones and a second battery, or a B battery, from the plate. There's the battery, the headphones, back to the cathode, or the filament, and this allowed the dots and dashes to be heard in earphones. Well, what's the significance of that? The significance of that is that as soon as voice transmission was available, you'd be able to hear it. You couldn't hear it with Fleming's device, so what DeForest really did was very significant. It's very small, and if you read any patent, it always says, I have found a new and useful, or a new and different use for something. And so he, by adding the B battery in the earphone, and then eventually adding the third element, which we know as the grid, to make the three-element tube, was able to make something that went beyond Edison and went beyond Fleming. I mean, they all had a purpose, but as you'll see in my book, and as you probably know because you're electronics oriented people, that every inventor, Steve Jobs included, looks at what came before and says, how can I improve this and make it a consumer experience? Or how can I sell more of these? How can I do a patent that will bypass the courts, and won't get sued for it? So every inventor does that. So I talk about that in the book. De Forest was significant in radio. He was an early radio broadcaster. The newspaper record, this article in the Times, was March 1907. It talks about De Forest broadcasting music to the Times Tower. And this is a 1907 phonograph. You see, again, every device that was invented always used the previous device as a model. So De Forest, for a radio telephone, used a telephone transmitter, carbon microphone. This is how they did it. There's a phonograph, and it looks like attached to the back of the phonograph is some sort of carbon microphone acoustic coupler to send record music. And then there's an arc. He used an arc transmitter. The interesting thing about this is, and it was quoted in this March 8th, 07 article, he said, Dr. De Forest began experimenting with his present apparatus last December. Well, what does that mean? Who else was experimenting with the radio telephone? Fessenden. The famous Fessenden 1906 Christmas Eve broadcast. The problem with Fessenden, and this is where De Forest kind of overwhelms every inventor because he always courted the press. Fessenden hated the press. He was a crotchety guy, if you can believe that. And Fessenden, and again, how do we know what we know? To answer that question again, how do we know that Fessenden did the Christmas Eve broadcast of 1906? Well, Fessenden said so, but not until 1930 in his autobiography. And so some recent scientists, there was a big article by Mr. O'Neill in Radio World, a couple of other articles, AWA Journal article a few years ago saying that I've searched everywhere and I cannot find, this is what the author said, the researchers, cannot find any information in the press about the Fessenden Christmas Eve broadcast. All we know is what Fessenden told us. Now, it probably happened because he had the device and he was doing it earlier in the month, apparently. But just the idea that, here's something that was 100 years old, and if you don't leave a record, well, there you go.
Well, I grew up in the next town from Marshfield.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, he did that at Grant Rock, which
Right.
is part of the town of Marshfield.
But he did something else earlier, which I do have in the book. I have some Fessenden stuff in the book, and I have the Fessenden researcher, Bell Rose, up in Canada, who is kind of counterpoint with some of the other researchers. There's a lot of detail in the book. It's ridiculously big. De Forest also used a radio telephone using an arc. While he was using his Audion as a receiver. Later on, by 1916-17, he was using his vacuum tube Oscillion as a transmitter of radio. So he was early in radio. Well, let's look at the locally, because the 1912 in Palo Alto is really important for De Forest because he developed his tube to amplify and to oscillate. Remember, three things: detector, amplify, and transmit, or oscillate. Federal Telegraph was the first Silicon Valley startup. Some Stanford professors financed Cyril Elwell. First, he tried to look at the McCarty patents in San Francisco, spark gap, and said, this is too crude, we can't use it. He ended up buying the Polson patents for high power, really high power international code using Polson arc. And we even have those at Parham Foundation, giant, big arcs. But this was funded by Stanford professors, and Elwell liked De Forest. De Forest was out of money as always around that time, and Elwell said, come here, we'll give you a lab, we'll give you assistants, you can do whatever you want, which is really kind of the way Silicon Valley is today. You know, if someone's a superstar, they'll give him space, and hopefully there was an agreement he would get something out of it. But this is what happened for De Forest. Now, sadly, as soon as De Forest got there, he was arrested for probably the second or third time, and this was written he wrote this in his diary, March 29th, 1912, and he was arrested based on stock fraud for exaggerating the value of the Audion. And I have all the court transcripts in the book. The prosecutor said, well, it's not even a good light bulb, right? Because he didn't give enough light. So anyway, in the trial, which I talk about in the book, a couple of DeForest business partners were put in jail. DeForest was exonerated, as he always was. He was accused, but he was never convicted. But anyway, what he said, just to give you an idea of partly the arrogance and partly DeForest the scientist, let me just read this. Since Wednesday, I have worried about what my arrest will cause my dear ones and about its outcome to me. Being guiltless, I fear not the outcome, only the heavy and renewed expense and the sense of the rank injustice of it all. I will probably fight it out here, then go back east for a long time. But here is my work, my income, especially during the coming summers when static problems must be solved. So, here's DeForest rambling in his diary. They're screwing me again, arresting me. It's not right. But, what I really have to do is be a scientist. So this is interesting. Throughout his diary, there are some racist comments, anti-Semitic comments, warm comments toward his family. There's a lot. And when you read hundreds of pages of this stuff, you probably can't read it now, but after a while you begin to click in and you realize it takes a while. But I transcribed all of these into type, and I used them, throughout. Anyway, wasn't even a good light bulb, right? While DeForest was in New York, getting married to his third wife, before he came back to Palo Alto and during the trial time, he had, while in Palo Alto, demonstrated his Audion to AT&T. They needed desperately a way to do transcontinental phone calls, that is from San Francisco to New York back then. And the ordinary telephone repeaters would not do it. And they thought, well, this Audion is probably ideal. DeForest demonstrated it, crude as it was, filled with gas instead of vacuum as it was. And they didn't do anything. AT&T found out DeForest was hungry, and so they let him sweat for about a year. And they brought in some attorney who said, I represented somebody, I can't tell you who I represent. I'm authorized to give you, I think it was $50,000 for the rights for long-distance telephony. And he was hungry, so he took it. Found out later it was a scam by AT&T. So, DeForest may have been a little on the dishonest side, but so was AT&T in that case. They actually tried to do that. So anyway, AT&T does this. They demonstrate this in 1915 at the Pacific Panama International Exhibition in San Francisco, known as the PPIE. DeForest also does an exhibit at the PPIE. His is really his transmitters and receivers and the radios he's now making using his Audion. DeForest drops in at the AT&T booth, and they have a brochure called The Story of a Great Achievement, Telephone Communication from Coast to Coast. They talk about Alexander Graham Bell. They talk about the capitalists at AT&T. What they don't mention at all is the name DeForest, when they just bought the patent from him at a price he thought was not fair. So DeForest, being the kind of promotion guy he is, went to the local printer, and overnight he came back with a copy. We have both of these in History San Jose. He called it, of course, the same thing, Story of a Great Achievement, and it's DeForest instead of Alexander Graham Bell, and he talks about it in a scientific way because, again, whatever else you think of DeForest, he was a real physicist, a real scientist. Anyway, his version, we have them both at History San Jose. Interesting kind of thing here. Okay, one final thing about the local Lee, as you probably know, and you will know more about this in another book we're going to have here at CHRS, John Schneider's History of Bay Area Radio, which we'll be selling to you when it comes out, March, April, May, or thereabouts. He set up a broadcast station using an amateur experimental call 6XC in the California Theater. I read it in his diary in January 1920. California Theater radio phone is in pretty good shape. Antenna on Humboldt Tower is not ideal, but the music has been heard 1,200 miles out to sea. So he was using, as you can see, his oscillon tubes in this device. Now, the significant thing about this, even though this never became a licensed station, was that this was the beginning of the year where KDKA would be licensed toward the end of the year in November and be that first commercially licensed station. But many people, well, not many, but a number of people were already broadcasting. I think Charles Herald had a 6XE or something like that call for his experiments. So there were people doing this sort of thing. Obviously, the audience was almost all entirely amateurs. Okay, part two of how the inventor invents. DeForest's claim to fame was that he put a variable density soundtrack beside the film so it would always remain in synchronization. And basically what we're saying is, you know, the actor speaks into a microphone, it's amplified, and the light vibrates in time with the voice. It is focused through a tiny slit, through optics onto a slit, and then it exposes the film along with the picture. It's a very crude version of it. I'm telling you, there's more. Obviously, the book does a great detail. But it allows sound to be on the film for the very first time. And so DeForest was not necessarily first doing sound movies, but I'll admit it, I'll tell you why. He probably did it right. This also brings up the DeForest way, which he did with everything he did. From an idea, he would get a patent, he would put it into practice, he would promote it, and he would try to profit from it. But of course, he never did because he wasn't very good at that sort of thing. Okay, so what DeForest did, like all scientists, he said, well, you know, if I'm going to invent something, I have to identify what the problems are. In other words, this is like the literature search that any scientist or writer does. You try to find out what else has worked and not worked, read about it, and then you synthesize all that information, and maybe you come up with some kind of a solution. Well, the solution to sound on film was obvious. Prior to DeForest getting into it in the late teens, the carbon telephone microphone was the only microphone existing. It evolved out of the telephone, and because there weren't radio stations on the air then, you really didn't need anything better, although there would be. But right then, it was a carbon microphone, and they're not very sensitive. And so if you're recording an actor speaking, the actor would have to be really close to the microphone. Otherwise, exponentially, it would be really soft as you got farther and farther away. So it was no good. Quality wasn't too good. It was okay for the telephone. It was fine for the radio telephone and the early experiments. The other problem, headphones for listening. Any early sound on film experiment before DeForest used the very insensitive selenium cell, which only could be heard with earphones. And that, of course, was because the Audion had not been made to amplify. And that's why DeForest really, that was a big thing he wrote, that Audion, because it did so much for the media that we know today. So all the pre-DeForest sound films either used a phonograph or a selenium cell. Edison and Dixon experimented in 1894, recording the sound along with the picture. The picture was on film, early Edison film. Edison was one of the first filmmakers, you know. And the sound was on a cylinder. Now, synchronization would have been a problem because even though you could have a horn speaker which would allow an audience to hear sound on film, Edison tried several times putting the speaker behind the screen and running some sort of belt, mechanical belt between the screen and the projection booth, and obviously it was labor intensive. It never worked. Eugene Laust in 1912, about the time Edison tried his last phonograph experiment, Laust put sound on film, but again the selenium cell, and so it was theoretical. You would hear it on an earphone, but it would not work. It would not change Hollywood filmmaking. So, and DeForest always said, he wrote in his diary many times, the limitation of the phonograph, 3 to 5 minutes on the side, never would be good for sound on film. He even tried a wire recorder. He tried a Polson tetragramophone, whatever that thing is. It's in the book. Telegraph, yeah. He tried one of those in 1913 in an experiment in New York at RKO to try to synchronize, because he wanted longer playing time for music as well as for film. So DeForest gets this idea. He writes it down in October 1918 on the back of a piece of paper while on a cruise on a ship. He writes down what actually is the entire sound on film. It has not been improved upon. I mean, it's, technical increments, of course, but what he basically says here, he says 3 minutes, 3 methods for photographing sound on film for talking motion pictures. A, use the speaking flame, which he began using some sort of gas. Imagine a nitrate film back there. I'm sure he had some big surprises in the lab, but anyway, he used the speaking flame. Second, very short, fine filament incandescent. Well, we know from the science of the time that a flame was much faster, and there was a lag with the incandescent filament, and so this is why it was not satisfactory. The third method, a glow tube light filled with gas, he says hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and so on and so forth. This was what eventually would end up to be the light that would write the actual sound on the film. But here is where DeForest shines. Unlike Laust and all these people before, DeForest pops in a triode. Hey, there we go. So from whatever the microphone is here, we go through out of the plate and through some sort of inductance here to the light, which he says fine slit, moving film, focused and variable density soundtrack. Now, this is really more theory than working model, because he tried for several years to make it good enough that he could show an audience, but it worked. But of course, and DeForest always admitted this, he read about Ernst Rumer in the 19th century, who developed the phonograph using an arc to write the sound on film. Again, Rumer's playback was the selenium cell and earphone, so it wasn't practical, but it showed that it could be done. And also there was Bell, Alexander Graham Bell, and his brother Chichester Bell, and somebody else. It's in the book. They did the phonograph signaling by light, so using the selenium cell. So anyway, it was not, DeForest didn't just wake up and say, I'm going to do this, but he took various bits and pieces from stuff he knew and created this piece of paper, which led to, less than a year later, filing in 1919, this patent for sound on film, which again says everything. It probably would not have worked satisfactorily, but he basically says everything to reproduce talking moving pictures from a single roll of film. He says, I have found a certain new and useful invention for means of recording and reproducing sound. So this is, he had two motives. He wanted to do sound on film, but he thought film would be a good way to have full-length operas, and I could listen to them playback in my home. I wouldn't have to keep turning over the stupid 78s from side to side. Anyway, we know that the 1918 drawing was accurate because this fully formed patent, which he filed less than a year later, confirms that he put it to patent, what he was really doing. Again, writing and reproducing sound using light. He was covered by the press in coast to coast and around the world. On August 23rd, 1920, here's what he says. He succeeded. He says, on this day, I made a photographic voice record on film with talking flame, which actually spoke to me. The words which I had forgotten were there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, August the 23rd, this was 1920. So he believed he had that scientific breakthrough after all this experimenting. I mean, his diary, as you'll see, and I've used a lot of it in the book, shows the painful process of invention. You just don't say, here it is, but it takes a long time to do it. And basically, we're writing and playing back. The actor speaks into the microphone, which is amplified, which makes the light flicker analogous to the audio, and it's exposed onto film. It's one of many processes, this being variable density. Really, the RCA photophone variable area ended up taking over what was used in the 1930s. After a few tries with this, DeForest was very good at putting on a white laboratory coat and sort of set dressing his laboratory and inviting the press to come in. He got some great interviews, and I've used bits and pieces of them in the book, but The press loved him because he was always out there and willing to talk to the men and women of the press. And again, having publicity is one thing that DeForest thought would get him not only reputation, but also would allow him to maybe attract people to buy his worthless stock. But he was very good at promoting. He wrote a series of articles and presentations in the Society of Motion Picture Engineers, now SMPTE, in the 1920s. Of all of the articles on sound film in the 1920s, there were 6 of them between 1920 and 1927. DeForest wrote like 4 of the 6 or 5 of the 6. So he was there. He was in front of scientific organizations. He wrote an article in Scientific American about this, the National Education Association about using sound film in education. He was always thinking. I mean, he was manic, you know. He was definitely an interesting guy. The DeForest way, he started the phonofilm company in 1923 and sold stock. It was not successful. He had a phonofilm UK operation, and the head of that, running it for DeForest, was Cyril Elwell, DeForest's old boss back at Federal. So DeForest kind of paid him back, you know, and took care of him. DeForest, while some scientists loathe DeForest, and many people, technical people do, there's one group, and you may all be a part of this, there's one group that loved DeForest to the end, and those were the ham radio operators. They called themselves the DeForest Pioneers, and they had annual meetings, and you know, this was a big deal, the ham wireless pioneers, DeForest wireless pioneers. Okay. But DeForest did not do the sound on film process by himself, even though he understood how it had to work. He heard about a man, Theodore Case, who lived in Auburn, New York, who fortunately for DeForest was a fellow Yale alum. Case was a smart guy, got his BA from Yale and went to Harvard Law for a few years, from a rich family, but dropped out because he wanted to be an inventor. And what he invented that was significant was he invented a photocell called his phthalate cell during World War I, which allowed communication between ships, but not on the visible wavelength. They used light that was above or below what you could see, and this photocell actually, you know, they obviously started with selenium cell, right? But the photocell actually amplified the light and allowed this kind of signaling. And so this is what Case was doing. This is his laboratory as it was last summer or a year and a half ago. Case owned about half of Auburn, New York, they fancy mansions and everything, but they preserved it all. They gave it as a museum, and it's being run as the Case Museum, and it has some interesting things in it, including the other side of the story between DeForest and Case. Anyway, that's his lab as he walked away from it before 1930. What Case did was he supplied the photocell, which he called the phthalate cell, and they've got boxes of them there at the Case Museum, and also the light that converts sound into light to record the light on the film. He called it his AEO light, standing for alkaline earth oxide. So again, gas-filled tubes with filaments and amplified. This is how it started in 1920. DeForest writes to Case saying, I understand you're producing a very sensitive photocell. So DeForest was checking vendors. Case actually wrote back and says, yes, we'll make sure you get one, but we want to order some condensers and resistors and things like that, some coils. So they started out ordering things from each other, but their relationship as it evolved through the 1920s was almost all science. Yes, Case was upset at DeForest for not paying his bills on time, but they mostly talked about science. You know, here's something from the amplifier going through the primary, the output of the plate into the primary, the secondary to the light, to write on film. DeForest writes a letter, and I just underlined Professor Pupin. Professor Pupin was in here Monday. The famous inventor, Michael Pupin, was in DeForest's lab. I mean, you know, you just drop those names like, oh yeah, Armstrong was here. Well, he wouldn't be Armstrong, but anyhow, this was the kind of thing that happened probably 2 or 3 times a week between 1920 and 1925 or so, they exchanged letters. Some rancorous, some were friendly, but they always went back to science. They always ended up dialoguing for a long time about science. The noise is due to the graininess of the emulsion, and I am taking the matter up with Dr. Mies of the Eastman Kodak Company to see if he can produce an emulsion which contains only very fine silver bromide. These guys were chemistry, they were physics, they were optics, electricity. I mean, it must have been very exciting back then because, you know, we know way too much today. They were just discovering these things, how to write sound on film. Anyway, there are plenty of correspondence and letters going back and forth. What Case really disliked more than anything else was that DeForest was getting all the credit for the work, right? Case wanted some credit. He wanted, you know, here's DeForest, his picture on everything, all the phonofilm advertising. Case was a small town guy, right, at Auburn, New York. And the reason, here's the reason. DeForest was exhibiting phonofilms at the Rivoli Theater in New York, and he asked, the question was asked, can we get Case's name up on the marquee or even on the title of the film? And here's what Hugo Riesenfeld, the managing director, said, and this explains everything. You surely understand that all of our publicity has been exclusively DeForest, which we consider a valuable asset on account of the great popularity of the radio. So here it was. DeForest was famous for 2 things in his life, radio and briefly for sound film. But this is what they were doing. They were using DeForest's name on the marquee, a DeForest system, because he was famous for radio. I want to show you the first of 2 phonofilms. This one does have DeForest Case patents on it. This is President Coolidge talking about the deficit in 1924, more or less.
The country needs every ounce of its energy to restore itself. The costs of government are all assessed upon the people. This means that the farmer is doomed to provide a certain amount of money out of the sale of his produce, no matter how low the price, to pay his taxes. The manufacturer, the professional man, the clerk must do the same from their income. The wage earner, often at a higher rate when compared with his earning, makes his contribution, perhaps not directly.
He's talking about Basic Economics 101.
In the advanced cost of everything he buys.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it, of course, because it's not important. But I want to do another one because Case, meanwhile, Case was developing a sound on film system which he thought was a new and useful improvement upon DeForest, just in very small ways. And he began making some films too, including this one, which is The Talking Duck, Gus Visser and the Talking Duck.
I've seen this.
It's very funny. Again, these were not films. These were recordings of existing media, like, for example, vaudeville acts, musical groups, bands, comedians. Everything was just a fixed camera on the proscenium of the theater, right? And a microphone somewhere, close as possible. Kind of disgusting, actually. Goosing the duck to make him... poor duck. Okay, so anyway, let me just say that if you go to the DeForest Facebook page, if you just type in the Google window Lee DeForest or DeForest King of Radio TV or something, you'll get the Facebook page. I have about maybe 10 of his phonofilms on there right now in fairly big screen. So take a look at them. Okay, well. As I say, Case, being a smart guy, Harvard Law, right, and Yale, he thought he had a system that was good. He patented it, but not until 1925. DeForest had already made the patents, but Case tried to make his just different enough. But when he sold it to William Fox to create Movie Tone, DeForest immediately sued. This thing was in court for 3 years maybe. What really ended up in the end was that neither party won. It was settled out of court. Fox Films gave DeForest a fairly decent sum. They all walked away. By then there were processes and sound movies being made every day. See, Hollywood didn't care. They could spend all the money in the world to solve these problems. But, and in the Case Museum, there are these big displays for court, these exhibits, these old dusty books. And what DeForest had done was cut out pictures from the Ernst Rumer book from the turn of the century. And both DeForest and Case said, well, you know, no one can really own this. You know, one saying that, well, you can't really own this. It goes back to Bell's photophone and Rumer's photograph phone. You can't own this. And DeForest or Case will say the same thing. Well, you can't own it either. So it became kind of, you know, it didn't happen. So anyway, it was a good idea, but did not happen. Warner Brothers jazz singer in 1927, DeForest writes in his diary, "Last night the flashing posters of Vitaphone gave me first a shock like a blow. Why and how have I wasted the past 2 years?" Well, the reason, and Vitaphone was a phonograph, a synchronized 16-inch, 33 1/3 phonograph. But because electrical recording had happened by 1925, the phonograph quality was quite high, higher than the sound on film processes. And again, the studios don't care because they did their mastering on these things and went from disc to disc to disc, you know, and mixed discs to disc. I mean, it must have been terribly noisy, but they knew what they were doing. But the real key, why do movies work? Well, Al Jolson had a big star. Same reason movies work today, a big star. The audience in the theater does not care whether the sound is on the film or on a phonograph record. They just don't care because basically it's what's on the screen. And The Jazz Singer was a transition picture. If you've seen it, there were a couple of scenes where Al Jolson sings to his mother or sings to an audience. And this is synchronized. But most of it was subtitles. So anyway, transition. Okay, let's wrap this up. The DeForest legacy. DeForest began telling his story as early as 1924. He told his story over and over and over again. There was a serialized in radio news. Maybe 5 or 6 or 7 issues, 7 or 8 parts of the DeForest story. In 1930, he met Georgiette Carneal, who did Conqueror Space or something like that, because he called his triode space telegraphy, right? And she wrote a book. Both of these said with the cooperation and permission of DeForest. So this was the authorized, these were authorized. Father of Radio, DeForest's autobiography in 1950. Again, what DeForest wants you to believe. You know, there were some. I mean, I've read them all, and they all have their purposes. We have this bust downstairs. DeForest was the kind of guy who he wanted to be loved. I mean, I think more than money, he wanted to be adored by everyone, and he was popular. I mean, people did know about him, even though he believed for years that he was screwed out of the sound on film process. He did receive an Oscar for it in 1959 to Lee DeForest for bringing sound to the motion pictures. So he was, in a sense, vindicated by the Hollywood community. And also in the very first group in 1961 of the Hollywood Walk of Fame stars at Hollywood and Vine, right there in the shadow of Capitol Records, is the DeForest signed star for motion pictures. Famous guy. If you're into movies, just coincidentally, I'll be done. Just coincidentally, there are 2 current films nominated for Oscars. Hugo is early silent film history, excellent film, as is The Artist, a very cute film which is about the transition. And I do the parallel history of film in the DeForest book. So see those movies. And that's any questions? I'm done. Thank you.
Did DeForest ever meet Scott Harold?
No, DeForest apparently never met Harold in person, but they exchanged one letter. Harold basically said, I was broadcasting to your booth in 1915 at the PPIE from San Jose, and you know, what would you say? I was the first broadcaster, because he was trying to cement his legacy. DeForest was not the first broadcaster. He started a radio station, which is significant, and student radio station, college radio, like I do. Yes.
How did all these primary sources end up in San Jose, California?
Well, of the three different archives, the reason the primary sources are in San Jose can be traced back to Federal Telegraph, because also, along with DeForest, Doug Parham worked at Federal Telegraph as a mechanician. And Parham had a home museum in San Jose throughout the 1940s and 50s before it went to Foothill. And so DeForest's wife, who was still alive because she was much younger, his fourth wife, heard about the Parham Foundation, I think through Cy Stein, the president of Parham at the time. She was going to throw all this stuff out, and so apparently she gave it to the Parham Foundation. That's a tenuous connection, but Parham, we have photographs, there's one in the book, of Parham and DeForest together, so that's probably the San Jose connection. Plus, he must have felt really good. He loved California, even though his final 30 years were spent in Los Angeles. He loved and talked about his days of hiking in the hills above Stanford and all of that. So he loved this area. Oh, yes, sir.
Edison did something with the film.
Who?
Edison. Thomas Edison.
What Edison did was help us make the transition from wet plate photography into motion picture. Eastman developed a flexible film base for a 35 millimeter, one of those, you push the button and send it in and they develop it. And so Edison heard about it, or actually there's some argument there because Edison's pal Dixon, who worked for him, claimed he did it. But he asked Eastman Kodak to make him a longer roll of it, which he used in his kinetophone, his peep show thing that he used, kinetoscope or kinetophone. And so, but these were silent, little 30-second silent film loops. So what it took to make the transition, again, and this story I write about in the book, that's why the book is so big, is, we went from wet plate photography to flexible film base. We also developed a start and stop action to be able to pull down the film, open the shutter, shine the light through, pull it down, stop it, shine the light through, but 24 times a second. And of course, Edison's light bulb was not quite good enough, but they used arc lights in the early projectors. But it was dim, and this is why he used the peep show format in the very beginning. And all this was happening back in the 1880s and 1890s. So I guess you could say Edison was very important. Matter of fact, Edison owned film until 1905, 1906, when the Film Trust came in. They had to buy his patents. He was kind of a ruthless guy in some ways.
What was Western Electric's involvement in producing movies?
Well,
Because
they were
a lot of the 30s and 40s movies you see at the end, you see sound by
noiseless
Western
recording.
Electric.
Well, Western Electric started, they developed the Vitaphone process because they developed electrical playback and recording of records, which changed everything from the horns and the groups yelling into the speaker. That was Western Electric. They developed the first Vitaphone system. They developed the sound on film system. They were the manufacturing arm of AT&T, of the phone company. They were like the science trust, like Xerox PARC or something like that, I think. I mean, if anybody knows more. Does that sound right?
And then they developed what's called the sound recorder.
Yeah.
With a variable split and variable slip to put the sound on the film.
How was that different though than what he was talking about, the variable thing on the side of the soundtrack, side of the film?
This is, DeForest is variable density, dark to light.
Like AM and FM, is that what you're talking about? Was that kind of a difference?
No, just a
They
different way
both
to
play back
expose
on the same projector.
just a
believe it or
different
not.
way to expose the emulsion on the film at the soundtrack area. This is variable density, and Western Electric system was variable area.
Which was a galvanometer magnetically moving to write the soundtrack, and a mirror, the light reflected on the mirror. I can.
More
I
like
think I
that
have drawings
slide.
in the book, actually.
More like that slide you showed earlier with the two examples, and there was a kind of a...
Yeah, it sort of looked like.
that was what it looked like, and everything became variable area by the 1930s. Western Electric did amplifiers, they did microphones, they did loudspeakers. I mean, they were big.
Before RCA?
Well, RCA was started in 1920 as a consortium, which included AT&T, which must have included Western Electric, because under the RCA agreements, it was Western Electric, right, that was allowed to sell transmitters for broadcasting.
Western Electric was an arm of AT&T.
Yes, they were the inventing. They were like the science arm. Yeah.
How does DeForest
fit into progression to the triode and the pentode? Does he inspire later later inventors of amplification?
Yeah, I think other people did a lot more with it. I mean, I think DeForest started out with a triode, which he thought had to have gas inside to make it work. And of course, they realized that it would have been a very noisy amplifier, and it was. And so other inventors, and when the phone company bought it, they immediately started with their high-priced scientists spending full time on it. DeForest just flitted from one thing to the other. He said, well, here it is. You want to buy it? He ended up selling 3 or 4 different sets of rights to AT&T. So, yeah, and DeForest ended up where his only rights until early 20s was to sell to amateurs. That was the license he had.
How well off was he when he, last years of his life, how well off was he?
He was not that well off. I saw his house in the Hollywood Hills. It's still there. I mean, somebody else lives in it. It was fancy for the time, but not a mansion by any means. He was comfortable because he did get royalties. He actually got royalties from what's now DeVry University, but it was called the DeForest Radio Institute in Chicago. He was for his name. I mean, he got stuff. He sold his tube business to RCA, I believe, in the middle 1930s. Got lots of money for that. You know, it was claimed he died with just a few dollars in his pocket, but he had stuff, you know. He had a nice car.
What did he think of Armstrong? Armstrong always said he didn't really understand how any of his stuff worked.
And I go into great detail about that in the book. He hated Armstrong in a very unreasonable way. He hated him, you know. And they went to court many times. In the end, the judge in the middle 1930s said, I'm not going to take any more testimony. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. What happened years ago is just going to stay. What happened in the 20s at the second or third trial, and so he did rule in favor of DeForest. But Armstrong and DeForest wrote letters back and forth and letters to Congress in the late 30s and early 40s. You know, DeForest and others, Dumont, for example, claiming that Armstrong's FM was not really his invention, but it was something that happened around the turn of the century. So, I mean, every inventor. No inventors were saints, right? I mean, if you can name one, he probably doesn't have very many patents or inventions. They all borrowed and tried to improve upon the work of those who came before.
I've watched I think it's the Empire of the Air.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And does he still have family, or is there family existing still?
He had 3 daughters. 2 by his third wife and 1 by his second wife, I guess. There's one, and the one was born in 1925, is in her 80s. Somebody, I guess her daughter, wrote an email to me, and I wanted to get in a conversation. I said, you know, where is she? I'll come in. It was. I'm trying to think of her name. It's in the book. The DeForest child. She speaks well of him, but she's very private and didn't want to really be talked to me.
So do they own any of his patents?
Oh, no, I don't think so. No, I think most of those expired in his lifetime. Patents didn't last very long. You know, the Audion patents, you know, started to expire in the 20s.
What did he do during World War II?
World War II, he did have some patents on some radar kinds of things. He was too old for the war, just like he was too old for World War I. So, but he did live to be an old guy. But in World War I and II, he spoke and talked about it, and he was a patriot. Okay, I hope you will buy my book, Lee DeForest, King of Radio, Television, and Film. It is an honest book. It talks about good and bad DeForest, and hopefully exposes him in a perspective that you can live with. You know, I think that Empire of the Air was a little anti-DeForest, wouldn't you say? But I'm not really.
Where's it available?
It's available downstairs. We're actually going to be selling it anywhere. I mean, just, you know, Amazon, any place. BarnesandNoble.com. There are no bookstores anymore. Okay, thank you. He wants applause.